Now I mentioned that we were going to create two directives, but so far we've only created one. The second directive is similar to the form field directive, but takes a little bit of a different twist. Think of it this way. With the form field directive that we've created, we can edit and potentially remove any field on our contact object. But what we cannot do is add a new field that is not already there. And that is what the add field directive, which we're going to begin in this screencast, allows us to do. It will allow us to create a new field of any type on any of our record objects, whether we're just creating it or we're also going to be able to use this directive in our edit contact form. We'll start where we left off here in our public/views/new.html template. This is the template that our new contact form page uses. And let's add our new directive down below. It's going to be called new field, and it's going to take a record, which will be the contact, and it will also take live equal to false in this case. And now that we've created one directive, you can see that this new one should be a little bit easier for us. In fact, both of these attributes, record and live, are going to do exactly the same thing as they do here in the form field directive. So let's go ahead and start with the template as we did before. This is going to be public views new-field.html. So we're going to start with a div, which for once will not have any classes on it. And this is going to wrap another div here, which will have our class row and also our class form group. Now what we're about to create is a Twitter Bootstrap drop-down menu. Basically, it will be a button with a little arrow on it, and it will say add new field. And when we click that button, a drop-down will appear, and it will give a bunch of different field types that we could choose. And these are the same types that we've seen previously. So it could be text, or it could be telephone number, it could be a date or a date time, it could even be a color. All of these will be available, and the user will go ahead and choose one of those, and then we will add that field to our record. So inside our row div here, we need to create a div for our drop-down menu. So it's going to be div with a class. First of all, it's going to be button group because this is actually a button that we're looking at. And we're also going to do the call-sm-offset-2 to offset it a bit. And then we need the drop-down class. But actually, because this is going to be near the bottom of the page, I'm actually going to do drop up instead. So it works exactly like drop down, except it allows us to move our drop down up instead of down. All right, so in here we have the actual button, and this will have the usual classes of button and button-default, but we'll also add the class of dropdown-toggle. And then we're going to use jQuery to activate this toggle, but we don't actually have to instantiate this with jQuery. We're going to let jQuery and Bootstrap.js do it on their own. Remember, we've already added those files to our main.html page. So now we can do a data-toggle, and we will call this dropdown. And that will activate our dropdown when this button is clicked. So inside the button, we'll add the text, add new field, and then we'll add a span with a class of caret. And this span will just show a little caret indicating that this is a drop-down field. All right, so now let's add an unordered list. It will have a class drop-down menu. Then in here, we will have a list item, which we will do an ng repeat on. And this will be the same thing that we did with the field types inside of our validation divs with ng messages in our form field directive. So we'll say key and value in types. And then in here, we can have an anchor element, which will have an ng-click attribute on it. And this will call the function show, passing it k being the key, but the user will see v0. Now, if you don't remember what these values are, I'll go ahead and open public source directives. And this types object here that we're looping over is this field types object right here. So k is the key, which is the keys here, which are the actual names for the HTML5 input types. And v0 is the user-friendly version. So URL as capital URL or telephone TEL as phone number. And so that's what will show up here. So now above this div, we're going to create another div, and this of course will have its own class, row, and form group. And this div will appear once the user has chosen a type to make their new field. And this is going to be a form of its own. So it's going to have an ng form, and we'll call this form new field. And we're going to add ng-if, and we're only going to add this element if the display property is true. So now in here, we want to have 3 divs going along widthwise inside of this Twitter Bootstrap row. The first div will have a class of column-small-2, right? And the second one will be 6, and the last one will be 4. Now in the first one here, we're going to have an input for the field name. So I'll have an input, we'll have the type of text, we will have the name as field name. We'll give it a class of form control. We will make this required because our field needs to have a name. We also want to add ng-model, and this is going to be field.name. So we're going to have a field object that we're keeping track of as we add our new field here, and the field.name will be where the value that they type into this input box is stored. Finally, we'll add some placeholder text that just says name. Now, we also want to have an input element inside of our second column. This input is of type equaling field.type, right? And this, of course, is going to come from this function down here. When we showed k is the type, and that will end up being field type up above. Now, the rest of the attributes will be similar to what we have above. The name will be field value. The class is going to be form control. This will not be required, meaning they can create a blank field. The model will be equal to field.value, and finally we'll have a placeholder that just says value. Finally, in the last column here, we will have two buttons. Both, of course, will have the class of button and the class of primary. The first one will say add. Go ahead and add this field to our record. And the second one will say remove. Both, of course, will need ng-click attributes. So let's go ahead and add ng-click, and this will call the add function. And then this one down here, ng-click, will call the remove function. Excellent. And there you go. That is the entire template for our new field directive. So in the next screencast, we'll write the JavaScript to wire up this directive to our page.